Last week, the journal Science Advances published the findings of a rather remarkable study about rats and the behavior of rats. And I have to say that until I read this study, ordinarily I only thought about rats from my brief encounters as a student at Columbia University in the New York City subway system. According to the results of the study, a group of rats who see another rat in a trap stuck will enthusiastically reach out to go and help that rat. But remarkably, they will only do so if a quote-unquote hero rat, or one brave rat, steps forward initially to try to help. Watching that one rat step forward and try to help its fellow is enough to motivate a whole group of people, or rats rather, to follow. Otherwise, remarkably or not, the study found, if there is no hero rat, if there's no rat willing to step forward and be the first one to help, then the rest of the rats will follow no one's example, and no one will go to help. Among human beings already, you may know we have an expression for this particular phenomena. We call it the bystander effect. Humans, unfortunately not all that different than rats, tend to look around, and if they see someone who's not willing to help, then they themselves do not go forward to help. And if we see someone helping, what's the first thing that we as human beings do? We understand it's a moment to help, and we run forward, and we go to help as well. But if no one goes forward to help, as has been well documented in human history, those of you who are a little bit older than me may remember Kitty Genovese in New York City, or even if you're not, the lesson of the Holocaust that we as Jews know quite well. If no one goes forward to help, then the human tendency, like rats, is to become bystanders, to sit back passively and to do nothing. Which is why perhaps even in an age before there were these kind of scientific studies, Hillel HaZaken, Hillel the elder said, "B'makom she'ein anashim hishtadel liyot ish." When a place where there are no worthy persons who are willing to step up to the plate, you must step up and you must be that worthy person. Hillel didn't need a scientific study to tell him that all it takes is one person, one hero, to lead everyone else in a charge to fall in line to make a difference in any given situation. In this week's parasha TEITZEI, we read a whole slew of mitzvot that deal with the subject of tzorchei tzibur, what our sages call our responsibility as Jews to our civic society and to our community. And what makes Judaism unique, I believe, from all of the different religions of the world is that the responsibility to be a leader, the responsibility to step up and do something isn't relegated to one particular individual. Rather, the responsibility to step up and make a difference is a responsibility that all of us in this room and all of us at home share together. Unfortunately, what we see in our society today is that, like our study, that is not what usually happens. So often, I'm ashamed to say today that when it comes to stepping up and making a difference and playing a role in your community, it's almost never your responsibility. We look around, and inevitably, it ends up being somebody else's. Yet the Torah, our parasha that we read this week, does not allow us to sit back passively as Jews, whether it's with our religious or even our civic responsibility to our society. Among my favorite mitzvot that we read this week, and because Amir is here once again, I want to make sure he's still awake, and so I'm going to quote the entire mitzvah in Hebrew, is to say the following: Lo tireh et shor achicha o et seyo nidachim, v'italamta mehem, v'ashev tashivem la'achicha. Which means that if you are walking by the field of your neighbor and you see that his ox or his sheep has gotten loose, what is your responsibility? The Torah tells us, lo titalem, vitalamta mehem. You may not ignore the problem. But as the text tells us, it doesn't matter if you're a rabbi or a farmer, or you work for Google. You surely shall return that ox to your brother and sister in need no matter what. Obvious, right? Well, Jeff Teague in his commentary on the book of Deuteronomy argues why it's not so obvious to everyone. A person, he writes, quote, may hesitate because it would either be inconvenient or possibly expensive to return or feed or lift up that animal. That's why the Torah and Hillel challenge us, b'makom she'ein anashtim, hishtadel liot ish, in a place where no one is striving to be a worthy person, you must stand up and be that worthy person. Don't be the guy. That guy, says Hillel, or that person, that woman, who when you see something wrong in your society doesn't do anything. Because whether your brother or sister or even your enemy, Chazal teach us, know it or not, the solution for a Jew to what ails our society cannot be to sit back passively and to watch. Some of you may know that this past week, a series of swastikas were painted on the corner of Post Oak Tritt and Holly Springs roads. Not far from where my children go to see their doctor. We actually had an appointment the next day. Not far from where the old JCC used to stand. The Atlanta Jewish Times, thanks to our very own Ronnie Robbins, broke the story. Thankfully, within hours of seeing those swastikas, as you can imagine, wonderful volunteers from our neighborhood had already come forward to paint them over. And yet when it comes to how we as a community and individuals should respond, I have to admit that when this kind of sad thing happens, within my own self, I have two separate instincts that are constantly doing battle with one another. The first instinct tells me that the right thing to do in response is very little. To acknowledge that it was a terrible thing, but to not make it a big deal. Because I know in my heart of hearts that these swastikas do not speak for the majority of people who live in our community. When a dear friend on my Facebook feed, a pastor in Dallas, Georgia, saw my post, what was his response? Dan, how soon can I come to paint the fence? That's the community that we live in. And it's the same voice that tells me that to prolong the news, to give it press coverage, to speak about it on a Shabbos morning from the Bima, only encourages anti-Semites and copycats to try again, because I know that it gives them the attention that they want, and they feel like they've won. And yet, on the other hand, there is also an instinct within me, and that it is one that stems from our parasha this morning. It's a voice that recognizes that if anashim, if worthy people, do not step up and say something when this kind of thing happens, it creates the culture and over time where this thing becomes tolerated. Because over decades and generations of ignoring things, we as a society become apathetic. Kids in school make Holocaust jokes with their friends because it's no big deal, it's ancient history. Kids, not knowing what the symbol means, doodle swastikas in their textbooks. Not because they're malicious, but because they think it's become acceptable, because no one speaks up and says anything. Imagine for a moment if in ancient Israel, an entire group of people, an entire society decided that when they saw oxes and sheep of their neighbors running around, imagine if an entire group of people decided to not do anything, to not stand up and help. The word used by our parasha is the word achicha. Your brother, your sister is in need of help. That's what standing up does. It builds relationships with our neighbors so they feel like our brothers and sisters when we stand up and are united together and care about one another. Which is why on 10 o'clock on Monday morning, I will join with other local clergy from our community at a press conference in which we will speak out against this act of hate. Not because I believe in any way it represents the majority of people who live in our community, but because if I don't, then in 30 years, Ethan, Maya, and Jake may choose not to do it. We cannot and must not be seen as bystanders when hate happens. B'makom she'en anashim, we must be worthy, all of us heroes, so that others will follow. Shabbat Shalom.